For most of my adult life, I've read about a book a week, and I've picked up some tips along the way to help you become a better reader, and that's what I want to share with you in this video. The first tip is you should read only good books. Because even the most prolific readers are only going to read a few thousand books in their lifetime. And so when you start thinking about it that way, you realize, wow, I really need to make the books that I do read count. But how do you know if something is worth reading? That brings us to our second tip, which is read mostly old books. So we all have a natural bias towards newness, right? We love the news. We like to update our social media feeds, see what is new, what's happening up to the minute. And the same can be true in our reading habits with books, right? You go to the airport and there's the newsstand and there's all the best sellers, right? And so you see new books out and you just buy these new books because it's exciting. But with books, newness isn't really an advantage most of the time. Because in my opinion, the best books deliver timeless insights. And most new books are going to be irrelevant in a few months or a few years at least. But how do you know which ones are going to be relevant or irrelevant? You don't really. So that's why you let time actually act as a filter for ideas. The books that are full of timeless truths, those tend to stand the test of time. They tend to stay in print. It was C.S. Lewis who said it is a good rule after reading a new book never to allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between. He doesn't say don't read new books. He says just rotate. Have some discipline to expose yourself to older books because there's a lot of good stuff in them. Next, skim before reading. If you've ever gotten to the end of a book and said, that was a huge waste of time, I really wish I hadn't spent so much time reading that book, you're aware that there's sort of a catch-22 here. How do you know if a book is good or not before you read it? When you're considering a book that you might want to read, start by reading the table of contents. What's the structure? What are the topics this author is going to cover? What are the arguments they're going to make? Look at the subheadings, flip through the pages. I like to read the last paragraph of some of the chapters because they tend to sum up what the chapter was about, and you kind of can get a taste of their arguments and what they're going to talk about. And that helps me make a decision about, is this going to be worth my time? Am I going to like this book? And if I skim it and I'm like, this doesn't interest me, let it pass, put it back on the shelf, pick something else. Next, you want to quit bad books as soon as possible. And this is hard because a lot of us have been taught that we shouldn't be quitters, right? And if you're interested in a channel like this where we're talking about productivity, you might have that sort of grit that makes you want to stick with things well beyond their expiration date, right? And in a lot of times that can be helpful, right? You want to have the discipline to stick with something, to not quit if it's a good thing. But if it's a bad thing, the sooner you quit, the better. Let's take smoking as an analogy. So if somebody quits smoking, nobody ridicules them as a quitter and says, wow, what a loser. You gave up on your dreams, man. You wanted to be a smoker. No, nobody says that. They say, hey, good for you. You quit because it was something bad. And so in my opinion, a bad book and a cigarette should both be thrown on the ground and stopped with the heel as quick as possible. You want to quit the bad books so you have time for the better ones. When I was starting seminary, I remember looking at all the syllabi and all the books we had to read for every class, and I thought, there's no way I'm going to get through all these. I need to learn to read faster. And so I actually got an app that taught me how to speed read. And so I did all these exercises that teach you things like how to move your eyes faster, how to scan chunks of words instead of individual words, how to stop yourself from doing what's called sub-vocalization. So I did all this stuff, and I do think it probably made me marginally faster at reading. But what I realized is speed reading is really a skill with limited utility, because what really matters isn't how many books you finish, but how the books are changing you, right? Are you absorbing what you're reading? And so I would say take your time and read the best stuff deeply, because in my experience, I'm often learning more from the book, not actually when I'm reading it, but when I set it down and I look up at the ceiling and just start thinking about what I just read, or when I'm driving or take a walk and I'm thinking about the book, right? We have this idea that the learning of a book is only while you're actively reading it and sort of downloading the information in your head. But the truth is, the learning is happening during the synthesis, when you're actually processing what you read. It's like trying to eat your food without chewing it first. Mortimer J. Adler says, in the case of good books, the point is not to see how many of them you can get through, but rather how many can get through to you. And so if you only try to read as fast as possible, you're actually skipping the most important part. Next, you want to write in the margins. So some people are really against this, and so let me make my case. Some people hate marking up their books. They want to preserve the pristine pages, but in my opinion, you're really just preserving the pristine pages of your mind. You're cheating yourself of a learning opportunity of actually interacting with the book by writing on it. Now, don't do this to borrowed books or library books, but if it's your book, mark it up, right? You're not vandalizing it, you're personalizing it. Because what are you preserving it for, right? If you're not underlining, you're not writing in the margins, why? What's the argument here? Well, I just like the way it looks, or, I want to preserve it because maybe I'll resell the book later. You don't make much money reselling just normal books, okay? They're worth next to nothing after you buy them. Well, I want to hand them to my kids. Well, hey, your kids want your marginalia. They want to see what you've written and your thoughts on it. That's one of the most precious things I have, is I have books from my parents that have their own thoughts written in them. And as I'm reading these books, I'm seeing what they thought about when they read them. In fact, I'm doing this with my own son. My son's name is Watson. We named him after Thomas Watson, the Puritan. And I've got Watson's A Body of Divinity here. And as I have gone through it, I've been leaving notes to him. And I think that's going to be a much more precious gift for him when he gets older than if I just gave him the book and said, hey, I kept the pages clean for you, bud. Good luck. And the next tip is summarize at the end. I remember some years ago, I was listening to Ian Murray, who's a Christian biographer, and he was talking about his own writing process and how he researches books and all that. And they said, well, where do you keep your notes, all that? He said, I just write them in the book. And he describes how on the end papers of the books he reads, he would just write little outlines of the book, write a couple of the parts that he thought were most interesting. He just did this a natural part of his reading. And so when he went to go write a biography, all this research was there, and it wasn't in some note-taking database. It was just on his bookshelf. So doing a short summary of a book after you read it, even if you're the only person who sees it, is still immensely beneficial in locking those ideas away in your mind. And lastly, share what you read. One of the best ways to have a new idea sink down is to have them bubble over. What I mean is you want to express them publicly. I love to talk to people about the books I'm reading. I love to talk to my wife about it or friends over coffee. One of the things I do, I think one of the reasons I like writing my newsletter or even writing articles, is it's a chance for me to share the things that I'm learning in what I'm reading. I often think that I'm probably getting a lot more out of writing the newsletter or the blogs than the people who are reading them, because it's forcing me to think more deeply about the stuff I'm learning. Well, there you have it. Those are my 8 tips for becoming a better reader. And let me just summarize it this way. We want to be wise stewards of both our time and our minds. And a great way to do that is to become more selective and deliberate in your reading habits. By the way, I am putting together my 2024 reading list for myself, and I'm looking for recommendations. So I'd love to hear what's the best book you have read in the last year or two. All right, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.